I would like to welcome our audience back to the Wide Open podcast. My name is Bruce Huberman, and my co-host is Paul Asciante. This is Season 1, Episode 19. And we are so excited this evening to have Max Bernheimer as our guest. Max has been a rock star in the business of antiquities for a good part of 45 years. He led the department in Christie's, and now is recently retired, and he gave up his gavel. And Max was a graduate of Clark University with me in 1982, and since then his career has skyrocketed. So, without any further introductions, I'd like to welcome Max to the podcast. And so, Max, welcome. And why don't you give our audience a little, where you come from, how you evolved into this antiquities expert, and we got a lot of other stuff to talk about. So why don't you tell us about your upbringing and how that sort of influenced your career?
Okay, so I grew up in a small town in Massachusetts, Mansfield, Mass, which, when I was growing up, nobody ever heard of, but I guess now today people know it for Great Woods or whatever it's called today, where they have concerts, but that wasn't there when I was there. I grew up very humbly, but my parents eventually opened with their partners, a large flea market in the next town over, Norton, Mass. And so,
no, where Wheaton is.
That's exactly right. And there's more to say about Norton and Wheaton when we get to the deeper history of my family. But the flea market kind of changed things for the family, and but it also exposed me to looking at things, because every Sunday during break time from working there, I would walk the aisles and I learned to look at stuff. So that was a key component for me. I think if we want to go back further, the people who were the most influential on my life and my career were my grandparents. And this is the part of the story which I think gets fascinating. So my grandparents were originally from Munich, Germany. My grandfather was already himself the third generation of his family active in the art world. So now we'll go backwards. So my great-great-grandfather came from a small town in Bavaria called Butenhausen. And his parents were textile sellers, common story for Jewish families. And back in those days, they traveled around Bavaria, seasonally, and they developed clientele all over the countryside. And, Jews weren't allowed to live in the city. But then there was a change of law, and my great-great-grandfather decided to use his parents' contacts, and he opened a small store in Munich. And he went to Turkey and places like that to source his textiles. And while doing that, he discovered antique carpets, and he decided he liked antique carpets maybe more than he liked doing textiles. Carpets led to antiques, furniture, sculpture, pottery, you name it. And eventually he opened in 1864 his business, which was called L. Bernheimer, L for Lehmann, his first name. And some years later, he opened a massive, beautiful kind of palazzo right in the center of Munich that still stands. And it grew to be the largest art business in all of Germany. They had incredible sponsors. They were the royal purveyors to the Bavarian court, that kind of thing. They really grew to be, major players. And my great grandfather Lehmann, he had three sons, Max, Ernst, and Otto, and the three of them became junior partners in the firm, and then eventually my grandfather did too. Now, it all came crashing down in the 1930s for obvious reasons. It was business between 33 and 39 was difficult, but it still existed. In fact, as you probably are aware, people like Hermann Göring were huge uh, consumers of art, so they were customers, and I'm sure that was an uncomfortable thing. So on the Kristallnacht, the Bernheimer house, as it was called, or Palais, suffered minor damage, but not serious, because Göring himself had told the people to leave it alone. And the reason for that was that he wanted it for himself. So the male members of the family were taken to Dachau, and eventually they were able to get out. So Dachau in 1939 wasn't yet a death camp, although certainly people died. They were, they did what they wanted. But my grandfather was in for a couple of weeks, and the rest of the family, some were in a little bit longer. That's another whole story. We can avoid talking about that. But eventually they got out. My grandparents, my father, my uncle, left for London, wanting to get to the US, but waiting for a US visa, another common story. That took about a year. Other members of the family went to Cuba, some went to Venezuela. And in fact, the big story around that was that Hermann Göring forced my grandfather's uncle, who was then the head of the firm, to buy from him a dilapidated coffee plantation in the small town of Rubio in Venezuela. He was forced to sell the family business for a song, and he was also forced to take one of Göring's relatives with him and his family to Venezuela, because that family member was married to a Jew, and Göring couldn't have that. So they needed to have him disappear. So that branch of the family went to Venezuela. As soon as the war was over, literally, this great uncle of mine got on the first boat and was back in Munich, reclaimed the business long before anybody was ever talking about, repatriation. He was there. He rebuilt the roof, got it up and running again, and that's the story of the Munich part. Now, my grandparents arrived in Norton. They chose that town because they saw that there was a college there, and they were under the mistaken belief that, oh, it's a college town. There'll be some culture there. There was not. No offense, people of Norton,
Yeah.
but it was pretty provincial, but a nice college, and they had a house eventually, right near the college, and they tried their hands at different things. They had a chicken farm for a while. They had a small restaurant for a while, and my grandparents were not well suited for those tasks. And eventually they got back into the art business, first having a shop out of their garage, and then traveling around the country doing, antique shows, art fairs. And then eventually in 1963, they opened their gallery in Harvard Square in Cambridge. And Bruce, I don't know, did you ever visit me there back in the day?
No, but I know of a little bit of the history of Bernheimer, the antique shop in Cambridge.
Great. And so that was very eclectic. My grandparents' shop was very modest. They sold European works, they sold Asian and pre-Columbian and Native American and African arts and antiquities. And my grandmother kind of specialized in antique jewelry. And so as a kid, I grew up, not only going to the flea market that I mentioned earlier, but going to visit my grandparents. And when I was in high school, they said, come and work for us. As soon as I had a driver's license, I would drive in and work for them. And even when I went to Clark, quite a few Saturdays, I would drive to Cambridge and work for the day. And, so I really learned a lot from them. I learned about the art. I learned about, connoisseurship. I learned about how to run a business, how to treat people. But as far as like my specific area of interest, this happened kind of by accident, because freshman year, first semester, I took a course, Intro to Greek Art and Archaeology, with Professor Paul Burke. And it just blew me away. I just had no idea that it was possible to know so much about the ancient world. And he was a great professor. He blew me away. And at that moment, I decided that this was what I was going to study. And that's what I did. I mean, I took every class that he offered. I did directed readings with him. And a story that I always used to joke about with him years later, because we became friends, was that junior year, I was walking to class one winter. You remember, we lived on my Loudon Street, and I had to kind of cut through some backyards to get to the classroom. And it was a typical Worcester, day, cold, wet, drizzly, ice. And I stepped on an ice puddle, broke through, and my sneaker filled with cold water. And I'm like, crap, I got to get out of here. So I went right to his office and I said, Dr. Burke, you got to get me out of here. And he said, all right, I know what to do. And he recommended that I go to the Intercollegiate Center for Classical Studies in Rome.
Wow.
And I got accepted. And so first semester, senior year, that's what I did. And that was just life-changing for me in every way that you can imagine. Instead of studying ancient art from books and slides or whatever we could see in museums around our area, I'm now seeing the greatest stuff on the planet. And we had great professors. But then on top of that, I learned about food, and I learned about wine. And that was also kind of life changing for me. I really loved what I was exposed to there. I had no idea. We have nice Italian restaurants in the States, better today than back then, but nothing compared to what was happening in Rome. So that really changed things for me. Shall I keep going?
It sounds like a book. You should be writing this. This story is spellbinding. I mean, and by the way, my wife is a professor at Trinity, and she's from Aachen. She's German. And she's an expert on Heidegger's works and translating, that Freud, Nietzsche, and it's really very, very interesting. She's going to love to hear about you tonight when we finish up.
Fantastisch.
Yes, yes. And my three children also speak German, but I've picked up on none of it. So
it's never too late. It's never too late.
yeah, I can't remember where I left my watch. That is incredible. So really, it's Roman, and that's what really caught your imagination.
Well, primarily Greek and Roman. Now,
Okay.
when we graduated, Bruce and I went to work almost immediately. My grandparents had said, you should come to work for us. And I thought I was going to have a couple of weeks to go and play. And my grandfather called me like 3 days before graduation. And he said, in his wonderful, thick Bavarian accent, is it possible you could come to work first thing Tuesday? I have an auction I must go to. So, dutifully went to work immediately. I lived in their apartment building right in Harvard Square, and I had a decade of just a fantastic life there. I started doing graduate work at Harvard. I had a mentor there, a professor named David Gordon Mitten, who was just sensational. And, he really, really mentored me through that process. And he too sent me away, as it were. I did a summer session at the American School for Classical Studies in Athens, and that was just fantastic. And so I got my master's from Harvard, and I was running the family business. My grandparents retired, and I was enjoying it, all of that. But in the mid to late 80s, Harvard Square really started to evolve. I might say devolve, because it was no longer filled with wonderful mom and pop type shops. These were all getting replaced by the big chain stores who wanted a foothold in Cambridge. And at one stage there were something like 80 used bookstores in Cambridge. I think there are 3 left. So that's what it was like back in the late 70s, early 80s. Um, but anyway, I thought, well, I should get the PhD, and I started applying myself in that direction by taking advanced German simultaneously with beginning Italian, because I knew I would have the language requirements. Talk about messing up your brain, studying two languages simultaneously. But I managed all right for a little while. But then an amazing thing happened in around 1990. I was sitting at my desk, and I got a call from the curator of Greek and Roman at the MFA Boston. He was a friend. His name was Cornelius Vermeulen, a formidable fellow. And he lived in Cambridge, so he often was coming through and stopping in the gallery. And his wife, Emily Vermeulen, also was a scholar, and she taught at Harvard. I had classes with her. So I was very friendly with him. And he calls me and he says, I just had a call from the people at Christie's, and they're looking for somebody to open their Antiquities Department in New York. And your name came to mind. Can I give them your name? And without really thinking it through, I said yes. And when I got off the phone, I couldn't breathe. It was the only time in my life I ever had a proper panic attack. And I got up, I walked out the door, I didn't say a word to my staff, and I had to walk around the block. I'm like, oh my God, what did I just do? This is Pandora's box that I just opened. But so I calmed down, I came back in, and decided this was probably an interesting thing. And eventually I got a call from Christie's, and I went to New York and I interviewed, and it was the craziest thing. I went to several different layers of people, and every one of them said to me, why on earth would you want to work here? It's crazy. And I said, well, I don't want to work here, but you guys asked me, so here I am. And then eventually they ghosted me. And this is before, email and all of that stuff. And I'm like, why? Here they are. Seemingly they were getting ready to offer me the job, and now I'm not getting any information from them at all. And so in October of 1990, on Columbus Day, so almost exactly a year ago, on this day, not a year ago, you get me. My wife had been in a film which was opening in New York, and we were going to the city, and I said, you know what, I'm going to go to Christie's, and I'm going to force myself in and find out what the heck is going on here. So I go to HR. I asked to speak to the person. Her name was Michelle Hertel. And they said, do you have an appointment? And I said, no. I said, but I'll be sitting here on this couch, and she can see me whenever she's ready. And they didn't know what to do. Nobody does that. But about 20 minutes later, she called me in, and she apologized profusely and saying, I'm sorry, please don't think badly about Christie's. I should have been in communication with you, but it's been a difficult year in the auction world, and we've had a lot of layoffs, and we just can't hire somebody new while we're simultaneously laying off people. I said, great. That's all you had to do was tell me. And so that kind of shelved that whole concept. But I carried on with my studies and continued with the gallery. But then literally 2 years later, I get the call again from Christie's, and they say, if you're interested, we're still interested. And, Greta and I talked it over, and I had to get the kind of green light from my grandparents because I was running their baby, and I called them, and they said, is this something you want to do? And I said, it is. And they said, then you should do it. And their attitude was, coming from people who had their whole world ripped out from under them, without their choice, they felt that if you're making your own choice, then it's a good thing. So off I went, and that's when I started at Christie's.
That's an amazing path, and so I think for our audience, just to get a little bit off track here, how would you define an antiquity versus an antique? I know it's a lot to do with age, but so what is an antiquity?
Okay, I love that question, Bruce, because it's been one of those things that drives me crazy. But so an antiquity is something, a relic or an object from the ancient world. Whereas antique is anything that's whatever, depending on the definition, 50 years old, or it's even less for a car, but typically maybe 100 years old. But for me and for Christie's, an antiquity was something from the ancient world, ranging from, almost the dawn of civilization down through, for us, it was the Middle Byzantine period was as far as we went. So we did Greek, Roman, Etruscan, European cultures like Celtic and all of that. We did Egyptian art and ancient Near Eastern art. And a lot of this, the Egyptian and Near Eastern, I really had to apply myself because I hadn't studied it formally. So one of the things I did was I started taking classes at the Institute of Fine Arts in the city with a professor who was the most phenomenal Egyptologist. His name was Bernard Boltmer, from Germany originally. He was also curator of Egyptian art at the Berkeley Museum. And incidentally, his brother, Dietrich von Boltmer, was at the Metropolitan Museum and was the world's leading authority on ancient Greek vases. So these are the kind of people that you had to know if you were active in the art world in New York. And I got to know them both and took a lot of classes. And Dietrich was amazing. I made a pilgrimage to the Met to meet him. He had been he became curator emeritus, and he had an office and away from the rest of the department. And I went up to see him, and immediately he started grilling me. He's like, "Bernheimer, are you from the Munich family?" I'm like, "Yes, of course." And from that moment forward, here's a guy who was really formidable and not particularly friendly to most people, but the fact that we had this thing that he knew who my family was made all the difference. He was super helpful to me. For example, I had in June 2000 this huge collection of ancient Greek vases that came oddly out of a Japanese corporate collection, which they had bought a decade plus earlier. And I told him that it was coming, and I had the draft of the catalog written, and he wanted to come in and look at everything and measure everything. And he said, "Let me see your manuscript." And I gave it to him, and he read it through and handed it back. And basically, he was one of these more Socratic type teachers. He wouldn't tell you what was wrong. He would make you figure it out, kind of steering you, in the direction. And that was just a fantastic process. What a great way to learn from a master. He was like the equivalent of the Japanese living legend,
So it's interesting. I spent, and Paul has probably been there as well, in Cairo, when my son he would go there and train, during the summers and in squash. And I went to Tahrir Square to the museum, and I mean, I was blown away by what was in there. But the thing I remember was, and now the museum has moved to Giza, but at that time, you'd see this incredible sculpture or this chair, and they had little pieces of paper, like notebook paper, and like handwritten, like a description of the item. And I'm like, oh my God, here's like this priceless item, and there's no fanfare, and like I was blown away. But I always remembered that there was like really, it was so primitive the way they displayed these artifacts, and I'll never forget that. Have you been to you? I'm sure you've been there to that museum when it was there.
I've only been to Egypt once. That was when I was still an undergrad. So immediately after my semester in Rome, I took a couple of weeks and I went to Greece first and then to Egypt. And I've been dying to go back, and I'm waiting for the new Grand Egyptian Museum, as it's called, to open. It's partially open now, and the opening has been delayed and delayed and delayed, but it's really going to be special. And so there's no point in going until that's open and really up and running completely and totally. But it's an amazing place. And honestly, going backwards in time, going from Rome to Greece and then from Greece to Egypt, and not having studied Egyptian art or whatever, the scale of things was what blew me away. It compared to, Greece and Rome, things in Egypt are so much bigger. And
Yeah.
it's
Well,
just
the dominant country in the world of squash today is Egypt,
really.
and by
Eons,
10x.
right?
Yeah. And I coached at the World Championships in Cairo, and the squash court was installed at the base of the pyramids.
One of those
And
movable ones, yeah.
yeah, exactly. And we were just visiting with Sheila Wolf, Tom's widow, this weekend in New York, and I noticed there was a poster of there's a big Egyptian art display coming up in New York at the end of the month. I don't know if you knew about that.
Of course I know.
Yeah,
It's I think it's called, I want to say Eternal Egypt, but that doesn't sound right. Anyway, it's
yeah,
the Met's always doing fantastic shows
exactly.
like that. Yeah.
But the one thing about the pyramids is I'm still not convinced. If to see that and the size of the blocks and the time frame that it was happened, and they've done nothing for 4,000 years after that. How did that actually get built? I cannot comprehend it.
All right. Well, just to add some color to that. Um,
Okay.
so the people who like to think that it was aliens or whatever, we have a word for them, and they're called pyramidians.
Okay. I'm not one of those.
No, I'm not saying that you are, but at least we got that out in the open. There was a scholar from the Oriental Institute in Chicago who theorized that they built ramps, and that's
Right.
how they did it. And then he literally built a pyramid in Egypt using the method that he surmised was the one that was used in antiquity, and he was successful at building a pyramid. Not one of the same scale, obviously,
Right.
but I think we need look no further than that. That's how they did it. Slave labor or manual labor, whatever, was cheap, and they understood about pulleys and rolling things on cut wood, and I'm sure lots of people lost lives and limbs
Oh, yeah, yeah.
building it, but wow, it is impressive. They are
It,
impressive.
I yeah, I know. I mean, it's mind blowing when you're there. And and in terms of sorry about my dog. Trixie. Sorry. Jeez. We'll cut that out. No worries.
We can't hear her at all, so don't worry.
So you know, how do you put a price on an antiquity, and when does it become for a museum or a personal collection? How does that work?
Well, in the auction world, as far as evaluating something, you look at the object, you study it for its condition, um, the quality, because there's a wide range in both of those areas, and also the provenance, making sure that the documentation is correct and that it's legal to sell it. And you factor in all those things, typically by comparing the object to whatever similar has sold in the past. A typical auction strategy is if let's say you have an object that you feel is worth, $100,000, for example, you try to bring it to auction with a more conservative estimate, something like, let's say, 70 to 90, knowing full well that it's worth more, because that estimate will attract the maximum number of potential bidders who then compete against each other and drive the price up. That's the ideal scenario for an auction. Um, but it's difficult because if you're the seller, you want to protect yourself with the highest possible estimate. And in the auction world, you're in a weird situation because you're representing the seller and trying to advise buyers, which are almost like two competing concepts. That's what auction, it's really a unique form of business.
So again, how does it, like you'll get a piece and that was sent to you usually by a collector, or how does or or a museum sends you a piece that they no longer are interested in? How does that work? And
It was all the above, uh, it was always great if you got museum property, which is kind of a funny concept. Let's say, so a museum, uh, we sold some things once for Toledo, which has a very nice museum, and they had things in storage that were just secondary. Although very good objects, they had better objects of similar periods and types that were on view. So they decided to sell so they could reinvest the money and buy something that would enhance the collection. And those kind of pieces always sell really, really well. People just, they have an extra layer of confidence when something is coming from a museum. But as far as how we got property, you work from your lists. You have client lists, people who have consigned in the past, people who have bought in the past, people who have loaned to museums. Sometimes they do it anonymously, but other times people do it by putting their names on it. And you gather names, and then I traveled all over the world, all over the US, all over Europe. I went to various countries in Latin America. I went to Australia, Hong Kong, Japan. I traveled the world looking at single objects, at collections. And the job was, if the people were ready to sell, you had to convince them that you were the best place to sell it. And that's partly just one-on-one. It's giving them confidence in you as an individual, but also having the Christie's brand behind you was huge. It opened a lot of doors. If I was still running my little family business, I could never have gotten into the places that I got into. Just nobody would pay attention. But when you work for Christie's, it was an easy access thing. So I over those 33 years at Christie's, I just built up a long list of clients, and I had 2 sales a year in New York, 2 in London, and we just always kind of looking ahead. You might have a sale coming up, but you're still working on sourcing property for the next one and the one after that. It was a never-ending pipeline. But let me tell you, it's not easy. The competition is fierce, mainly between Christie's and Sotheby's, but there are other smaller auction houses that are good as well.
I have a dear friend that has been very active at Christie's. I'll tell you his name offline, but he has a very large collection of Ming and Tang Dynasty work, and that is super impressive to see.
Well, and it's a market that over the last decade or so that's just been so dynamic, because with the growing private wealth in China, there was this movement to buy things back. So that a lot of Chinese properties that had come to the West in the 18th, 19th, 20th century were going back. So there were some difficulties. I know there were some sales that were blemished because there were high prices achieved, and then getting the people to actually pay was a problem. But what can you do?
so, since you've been all over the world and been to every flea market, antique show, what was your best find that would some like they maybe not realize what they had and that you were able to get for like a great price?
Well, let's back up a step, because the auction process, I don't acquire things, I don't buy the things, right? People consign
No, no, no. I'm talking about personally. Like you went to all these antique shows
oh my gosh.
and flea markets, and did you ever find something that was just outrageous that they didn't know what it was?
That happens all the time, Bruce. I still do that. Um, gosh, there's been so many things like that. One of my favorite categories, in which I wrote my thesis on at graduate school, is ancient engraved gems. So basically, seals, something that you would use, stamping it into wax as your personal device, your personal signature. And I have found those kind of things not frequently, but at art fairs and stuff where people just don't know what they have. One that's Greek in 5th century BC, um, unless you know, um, might look like it's from the 19th century. Um, but luckily, I know. So I bought some great things for little money. Now, look, if somebody is in a shop and they're selling it and there's a price on it, you might bargain a little bit or just pay the price, and that's fair game. If somebody had come to me at Christie's with something and they didn't know what they had, that's a different story where you would always say, it's worth what it's
X,
worth.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Wow.
that's got to be
So,
like just a major rush when you find something that that people don't really understand what it is, and
yeah.
It's shocking to me that it's still possible to find things, but in the 6+ months since my retirement, I accumulated driving my wife crazy by doing so, but probably a dozen things that I bought for nothing that are worth, not gigantic amounts of money, but if you buy something for $40 that's worth $5,000, that's a pretty good markup. Now I
Yeah.
just have to sell it. Um, and I've kind of got my daughter into this as well, so she likes going to flea markets and antique shows, and she's my good luck charm. I always seem to find something when I'm with her.
And do you feel like you do need to sell them, or will the value just increase and you give that to your grandchildren?
Um, Great question. The things that I bought in the 6 months since leaving Christie's, I don't have any intention of keeping them for the long term. It was, I just recognized that these objects were undervalued and I'll sell them. I have a lot of art in my life, some of which has been in my family, going back to my great great grandfather. So, and those things I wouldn't sell. Those need to be passed on to my daughter.
That's so cool. Now, are you involved with the archaeological digging aspect of this, or did I misread that?
Well, I did in 1991, so the year before I started at Christie's, when I was still trying to decide, whether I was going to stay in the antique business or maybe go full force into academia. I got invited to participate in archaeological excavations at Caesarea in Israel, and I did that for a summer, and it was really fun. Hard work. Um, we were kind of digging a trench and removing huge blocks, and in the hot Mediterranean sun, it was really vigorous, hard work. And I decided after that, like, well, that's probably not for me. I like working with objects, not broken bits of pottery and large blocks of stone. But it was fun, and I'm glad I did it, to get that experience.
so for a young person who's sort of interested in your world, how would you advise them in terms of you know pursuing a career in the antiquities business?
Well, I think it's really important to get your academic credentials in order, right? You know, grad school, highly recommended. The problem there is that a lot of the programs are kind of anti-art market. So making the leap from academia to the art world is not always an easy one. And it might be a kind of a one-way trip, if you will. But when I hired people at Christie's, normally they came with, at a minimum, a bachelor's degree in my world, but preferably a master's or even a PhD. It's not absolutely necessary. I mean, you can, if you're smart, you can just get a job, maybe start as an admin and work your way up. And it's not impossible to really learn about the objects from firsthand experience. And I think I was pretty good at imparting my knowledge to people. There's a good crew of people who are still at Christie's, both in New York and London, who, trained under me, and they're doing great.
So, Max, I tried 2 years ago to retire. That lasted about a week. Um, Because I realized I didn't have any hobbies and my purpose was messaging and paying it forward. How are you doing in retirement?
Well, I have been playing a ton of tennis, but
Yeah.
to the detriment of both of my knees. But we'll deal with that one way or another. Um, I've been doing some consulting um, for some dealers, collectors, and even some work still for Christie's. I've been doing some appraisal work um, for which I'm paid, obviously, and been doing some traveling. I I think I probably will stay active in the field at 65. I feel I had kind of hoped to stay at Christie's a few years longer than 65. And I guess we didn't talk about that part of it. How did I come to retirement? And it was really the product of a slowdown in the auction world. Not my department per se, but the big departments like jewelry and impressionists and contemporary art. Uh, with all of the uncertainties the last few years around, the wars, Ukraine and Eastern Mediterranean, and with the election here, people who didn't have to sell didn't. And therefore, the big departments in both auction houses were down by as much as 50%. And so when that happens a couple of years in a row, the bean counters start looking around like, how can we save money? And at 33 years, I became expensive. And so they asked, it was a gentle departure. I was well taken care of, but I would have stayed a few years longer if they hadn't asked me to leave.
So,
But because of loyalty to you, they took good care of you on the way out the door.
Oh yeah,
Good.
yeah. As I say, I'm still doing some work for them, but
Mhm.
not dealing with the daily grind, and I'm enjoying that.
so here's totally something off topic. You grew up in New England, and now you live in New York. I know you're an ardent, Red Sox fan, and so how do you find the fans in New England as opposed to the fans in New York? What could you
Oh,
sort of compare them, and what are your
I
feelings about
think
that?
I think I can only really speak about Yankee fans versus Red Sox fans. Um, I don't like going to Yankee Stadium, to be honest. I find it's quite hostile. I suppose if you're a Yankees fan going into Fenway, it's the same. Um, but when they built a new stadium here in New York, I took my daughter, who was then probably about, I don't know, 12 or 13. And I had seats out in the bleachers, figuring that, oh, they're expensive seats now. It should be okay. And there were so many fights happening around us that I said, we can't stay here. And we just went and found seats elsewhere. So I don't like going there because it just doesn't feel safe if you're in Red Sox gear and it's a Red Sox game. I'm sure in the other parts of the grandstands it's fine, but not out there, not in the bleachers. And I'm positive that it's the same at Fenway for a Yankees fan.
Well, Max, I'm gonna have a present for you. So I have bounced out the first pitch at Fenway Park 11 times, and the president and CEO of the Red Sox is a friend of mine and a Trinity alum. And so next season, I'm going to bring you up there, and you're going to get to sit in a different environment than you might normally sit in. Um, my answer to Bruce's question is, and I was born right across the street from Yankee Stadium, is in Boston, it's every man's park. You could be sitting in an expensive seat next to a taxi cab driver whose family has owned that seat forever. In New York, at least except where you were sitting wearing a Red Sox outfit, it's corporate. It's just what watch do you have and what car did you drive in on? And I can't stand that at all. So next year we're going to stay in close contact, and I'm going to get you up there for a fun Red Sox game.
That's great. I've sat all over the park. Used to have season tickets back in the day with a mutual friend of Bruce and mine. We had seats in the bleachers, but they were relatively inexpensive and they were the night games. So I went to a lot of baseball games back in the day. And I took a few years off because the Red Sox have been so horrible. There was no incentive to go, but they were entertaining at least this year. And Ella, my daughter, wanted to go to a game, so I got tickets, and we were in those seats, kind of on the first base side, but way up. Those special. There's only like, I don't know, 12 rows or something, and it's a really good place to see a game.
Well, we're going to get you both up there next year for something special.
That sounds like
That'll be
fun.
great.
Yeah.
That sounds like fun.
So, we had your friend Mr. Morano on, and he was telling us that story about the book he wrote, part of the Echo series, and the whole relationship to the Grateful Dead. And why don't you tell us about a little bit about your history with the Grateful Dead and how that evolved? And I,
Okay, so that's a good story. At least I like it. Um, Freshman year, um, my roommate was Steve Sadowski, and he was a Deadhead, and I was more of a kind of hard rock type dude, and
Zeppelin, baby, Zeppelin.
all of that, all of that. Um, and he had the Dead posters on his side of the room, and I had my stuff on the other side of the room. And but he had a lot of cassette tapes of live shows and most of the albums, and uh, he was playing it a lot. And he kept saying to me, "You got to go see him live." And I'm like, "Okay, I'll do that." And it's funny. I remember once I was in the room by myself, and I thought, "All right, I'm going to listen to something and just by myself and really focus on it." And I kind of by accident, I picked the album Blues for Allah. And I ended up on the side, Bruce, you probably know it, with the song Blues for Allah. And I'm listening to it and I'm thinking, what the hell is this crap? But then I flipped the album over and I'm like, okay, that's more like it. So anyway, he and I bought tickets to go see the Dead at Madison Square Garden in October of 78. And this was shortly after the Dead's trip to Egypt, and Jerry came back um, and got ill, probably because of his introduction to a special strong type of heroin. But in any case, the show was canceled and rescheduled for January of 79. So that was my first show. We were on the floor, right in the middle. And that's where I had my epiphany, because I'm listening to this music and I remember it specifically. It was during Eyes of the World, second set, and I'm completely sober. I maybe had a couple of beers, not much more. Contrary to the Dead ethos, I was pretty straight at that moment. And so here's the song, Eyes of the World. I'm looking around, and the whole entire bowl of Madison Square Garden is just in movement and undulating and dancing. And I've never seen anything like that, and it blew me away. And I was hooked from that moment forward. And I'm really grateful that Steve, introduced me and that I got on the bus early enough to still see Keith and Donna. Not many of our contemporaries can say that. And so after that, luckily for us in Worcester, Bruce, the Dead played everywhere: Springfield, Hartford, New Haven, Providence, Boston, Cape Cod. You could go and see 8-10 shows on a tour without having to drive very far.
and too bad the Centrum wasn't there when we were, in college, because that was right in our backyard.
I know. I never saw a Dead show there. I saw the Dead post Jerry, uh, but yeah, that was an amazing thing. So I saw a lot of shows. Uh, my favorite was in September of 1980 at Lewiston, Maine. It was an outdoor show. Did you go to that one?
No, not in Lewiston, but I'm trying to think of the town that I went to in Maine, and that's the time I ran into the Dead. They were, we were looking for a place to stay after the show, and we're driving around, and we see this Holiday Inn, and we see all these cars and motorcycles and stuff. So my friend and I, we go to like what's going on? We actually went to the front desk and said I said are the Grateful Dead, here, and they're like, yeah, they're all hanging out over there. So we went and we walked over and we walked up the stairs and we get to the top of the staircase and Bob Weir is just standing there with a glass of wine. And so we walked over and we said hello and he went to shake our hands and he like spilt the wine and like it was classic. And Jerry, I guess, was locked in the room with a bunch of women or whatever. And but it wasn't Lewiston. I'm trying to. It'll come to me the name of the town, but they were. It was great. I mean, and then after the show was even more exciting when we got a chance to meet Weir.
That's a
But
great experience. The Lewiston show, if you can find it on the Dead, sphere somewhere, it's worth a listen to it. There's some of the show is only audience recording. Some of it's the good stuff, Betty Board or whatever. The other great experience I had with the Dead was I guess it was 1991. I got a call from Chet Rotter, another Clarkie, and he's like, I have a ticket for a Jerry Garcia band in Hartford. Can you come? And so, yeah, I got in the car, drove to the show. What he hadn't told me was that the tickets were for the second row, and I was seated right in front of Jerry. I mean, we're talking spitting distance from Jerry. So the show starts, and I'm sitting there, and I'm just in awe because it's just you're right there in front of Jerry. And I'm looking at him and I'm watching him and I'm making eye contact and I smile because, like, why wouldn't you? And I think I see Jerry smile back at me and I'm like, that can't be what just happened. But then I do it again and I smile and he smiles back at me and I'm like, oh my God, I am communicating with Jerry Garcia. And it was a great show. I think in the 90s, Jerry it was hard for him in the Grateful Dead. And it was so much more relaxed and fun for him to be touring in the Jerry Garcia band. And, Merle Saunders, not Merle Saunders, Melvin Seals, great keyboard player and all of that. So years later, after he died, and that biography came out about him, it mentioned that Jerry, had severe stage fright. And his way of dealing with it was to try to find somebody, he could probably only see 4 or 5 rows into the arena. And he would try to find somebody that was giving off good vibes and he would play to that person. So I now know in retrospect that I was, at least in my mind, I was that person that night. So it's a great experience.
And there were no
That's
cell
awesome.
phones to take a quick snap back, in those times.
Nothing. Yeah, it's all up here.
That's wonderful.
It really is. And then, I asked John about the difference because I've never evolved into a Fish fanatic or fan. How about yourself? And what you think the difference is between the Deadheads and the Fish heads?
Well, I've gone to probably under 10, but close to 10 Fish shows. And while I enjoy it, it still hasn't won me over. And I'll tell you what the big difference is. The big difference is Robert Hunter. So Dead songs lyrically have depth, whereas most of the Fish songs seem really trite. And so while musically they're out of this world, there's just the songs, it's all jam. There's no substance beyond the jam. And I don't think that's the way it was with the Grateful Dead. There was substance. You could take what you want from the song. The message was often ambiguous, but there was a message. And I don't get that with Fish or any of the next generations of jam bands. They're fun, but it's not the same for me. So I've seen every version of the remnants of the Grateful Dead since Jerry passed, and I still enjoy those. I mean, I just went to a show on Friday night with called O'Teal and Friends, which one of the friends was Merle Saunders, and that was really fun. So it's not the same. That's better than a Fish show for me.
Yeah, no,
Yeah, my
I
son's
have
a
to
fish head.
think the Jerry Garcia band and the renditions of that are just
Yeah.
incredible. I always loved Garcia. I mean, he's a different person when he's performing with the Garcia band versus the Dead. And I mean, obviously we love the Dead, but you really get a different flavor when you go to a Jerry Garcia band, show, which I always enjoyed.
Well, if you haven't had the chance to see Melvin and JGB, you should,
I think I
because
was at the show with you in Portchester.
that's right. That's right. So
That's
bad memory
very
of mine.
cool. I went to a Santana concert very soon after he passed away. And in the back of the stage was just this huge, picture of Jerry Garcia. And Santana came out with a rolled up newspaper that was a joint. It was like the biggest joint I've ever seen. And when they started off by playing a Grateful Dead song, and then Santana went like this, and a dove flew out of his hands. And it just blew everyone's mind.
I love the story of Woodstock where,
Right.
you know, Bill Graham begged the promoters, you got to have Santana there, you got to have Santana there, and they agreed. And he was supposed to go on at a certain time, and it was late in the course of the evening, and Jerry's like, "Here, take this. You'll be fine by the time you go on." And he does. He drops acid, and then all of a sudden they say, "You got to go on now." And he's like, "I can't go on now." Well, you're going on now, or you're not going on at all.
Oh my God.
And you can see it when you look at the film that they are high. They're
Yeah.
really high, but they knew how to hold it together, and they played the greatest show ever for them, I think, at Woodstock.
Yeah, for real.
So as we wrap this up, Max, this has been really a lot of fun, and so happy that you were able to come on and just give us a little bit of an education and learn about the antiquities world and all. And your pathway is just incredible. It's so not typical, and a lot. You have a lot to be commended for because you really, as they say, maximized. Right?
Ah,
Maximized. There you
nice.
go.
Yeah.
See what you did there? That's good. Yeah. You
Bruce,
know,
can
Career.
you send me Max's mailing address? I'll send him something tomorrow.
That'll be nice.
I'll do
So
that.
as we wrap this up, thank you again for coming on, and we'll keep you posted. And it's been a really a good time. So thank you again.
well, thank you both. I really enjoyed it, and I'll have to go back and look at the previous ones that you've done, which I haven't had a chance to do yet. And let's get together. It's time for another show.
Well,
We'll,
you
we'll-
were great. You match up with any of the people that went on before you. Is the taping stopped?
I mean, no,
Stop.
I just I know when to stop it. It's fine.
So does the name George Weiss mean anything to you? Very active at Christie's.
No,
Okay.
I not George Weiss. No,
Okay.
he's your Chinese collector.
Yeah, well, everything. He's got an insane collection in his house up here in West Hartford with, Monets and Picassos but I'm particularly interested in his, Ming and Tang Dynasty stuff and it's pretty interesting to see.
Cool. Not my
Right. So
world, but I
Max, we'll
like
keep you posted, and when we get the
Yeah.
edited version, we'll send it off to you, and then for approval, and we'll go from there. But I think we kept it pretty above
Oh,
board.
yeah.
So
Max, who was your favorite tennis player?
me. No, right now it's Alcaraz. I mean, I
But coming up in the classics.
Beyond Board
Yeah.
was my idol in those days. I had the
Yeah.
same long hair, the headband. I was
Uh-huh. So I coached team tennis for 11 years, and we had Monica Salas and James Blake, and I played in the qualifying for the U.S. Open at the Port Washington Tennis Academy.
oh
And
wow.
I was on court, and of course, nobody was going to watch me. And about 8 courts down, there's a crowd. And there's this scraggly looking guy on court with a very funny hitch on the backhand side using a Bancroft racket. And that was Borg.
Uh,
Unbelievable.
it's so funny when you look at the video from that era versus the way they play today. It's a
Uh,
different game.
I love that. I mean, we won't see another McEnroe, I mean, because the power has taken it all away. But, like McEnroe could slide an approach shot, would slowly go deep into no man's land, and then he's hanging on the net. They can't do that anymore. They're blasting balls all over the place. Doubles has become unwatchable. It's just first strike
We grew
but
up in an era watching like the Harold Solomons, Eddie Dibbs,
yeah.
all those. I mean, it
Yeah.
was great. Stan Smiths, Bobby Lutz. I mean, all these tremendous.
Wojtek feedback, Guillermo Vilas.
Yep.
Yeah. So here's a quick tennis story. Um, have you ever participated in the group that call themselves past masters? And
No.
they I don't know if it still exists, but they follow around the circuit, the major tournaments, and they do events. And this goes back to the mid to late 90s. And they used to stay, I guess their sponsor was the Swiss hotel.
Hmm.
Christie sent a lot of people there. And so they gave a spot on this one night to Christie's, and everybody knew I was a tennis player. So I got to go out to the West Side Tennis Club
Love it.
and play doubles with John Newcomb and who else was there? Somewhere I have a. Hold on one second. I think I have it.
I love it.
Uh,
Newcomb and Roche and all of those
Oh, and Kenny
guys.
Rosewall.
Oh,
yeah, I think Rosewall was there. Anyway, I can't find it. I have a photograph of me, and I was playing doubles with these guys, and I actually aced Newcomb, and he was like, "What do you think you are, Pete Sampras?"
I love it. That's
Great.
awesome.
Yeah.
You should write a book, man. You've got some very interesting stuff.
You're the second person to say that to me in the last 3 days. I guess I ought to think about it.
You should. Your problem is going to be direction because you can go down so many roads with depth. The book that I wrote, which is now being made into a movie, the funny story about that was I had the honor of coaching Tommy Wolfe. His father was Tom Wolfe, and Tommy gave Tom his honorary doctorate on the day that Tom gave Tommy his college degree. And when he graduated, Tom called me and he said, Coach, you're going to write a book. And I said, no, come on, what are you talking? He said, no, you're going to write a book. And the hardest thing about writing a book is getting an agent. So I'm going to get you an agent. So, all right, whatever. So I'm on the tennis court teaching the team, and my cell phone rings. And it's Coach, this is David Black, and I'd like to be your agent, being the schmuck that I am. I said, well, why should I let you be my agent? And he said, well, that's a fair question. I'm the agent for Mitch Albom, Tuesdays with Maury, and Dan Brown, the Da Vinci Code. I said, oh, I think you can be my agent. And that's how it all started. So the key is to get you an agent, and then you can get going.
Well, I got to figure out what I'm allowed to say. Some of the stories that would be really good, I probably can't reveal names and stuff. But I guess there's a way to work around it.
Well, let me tell you
Change the
something. The
names.
beginning of tonight's, podcast. I mean, the story about your great grandparents and being,
Oh,
in Germany. I
yeah.
mean, that stuff is heavy duty. Really,
Yeah,
really good
it,
stuff.
it has been written before. I have a cousin in Munich who did write that, so a lot of that information's there. But I guess it's not in English.
Yeah, well,
So
it's not your spin. You have a different spin on it and a different
Yeah.
take, and I think it'd be amazing.
Well, guys, I've got to help put little girls to bed. Thank you so
All right.
much,
We'll be in
Max.
touch, Max. Thank you again.
All right,
Thanks,
guys.
man.
All right.
Cheers.
Good night.
Bye-bye.